Right. There we go. Good morning. May I welcome all members and officers to the hybrid meeting of the Education Overview and Scrutiny Committee. This meeting is able to be viewed live by members of the press and public today. Therefore, may I welcome anyone that may be watching remotely. A recording of this meeting will be made available on the Council's webcasting and YouTube channels. After the meeting has concluded, should anyone else who wish to view it, please be aware that this meeting is being transcribed only for the purpose of producing the minutes. The transcript will be deleted once the committee approves the minutes, and it should not be downloaded by anyone other than Democratic Services. To confirm, as a council, we welcome the use of the Welsh language in our public meetings, but I can confirm that I have not received any notifications or requests to use Welsh today. Therefore, the meeting will be conducted in English only. May I remind members to refrain from using the chat facility and instead use the raised hand icon to indicate when they want to speak. Please could you also keep your microphones muted when not talking, so there aren't any interruptions encountered. May I also remind members that as per the statutory guidance under Section 4 of the Local Government Wales Measure 2011 and our formally adopted hybrid meeting policy, any member attending a meeting remotely must be able to be seen and heard by members of and officers who are attending the meeting, as well as by members of the public viewing the meeting. So can I ask you all to please use your cameras for the duration of this meeting. Moving on to the agenda, could Jade, our Democratic Services Officer, confirm if we've received any apologies, please?
Thanks, Chair. We've had apologies from Mr Cunningham this morning and Councillor Clark as Executive Member.
Thank you, Jade. Are there any other apologies anybody's aware of? No. Thank you. Just checking online. There we go. Agenda item 2, declarations of interest. Could I ask members in alphabetical order to state whether they have any declarations of interest? Councillor Best, are you online? Can't see him. No. Councillor Cowles.
Thank you, Chair. I'm the Governor at Blenavon Heritage School and Abersycon Comprehensive School, and I've also got a brother that attends Abersycon as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Victoria Haller.
Parent Governor Yscol Panteg.
Thank you. Councillor Janet Jones.
Governor of Blenavon Heritage School, a grandson at Abersycon Comp, and a niece at Blenavon.
Thank you. Councillor Mark Jones.
None that I am aware of, Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Keith.
Morning, Chair. Grandchild in Castlekeeliog School. Thank you.
Thank you. I am a member of the Pro Management Committee, and I have grandchildren in the YGG and the Federated School of Coedwiver and Blenheim Road. Councillor Simons. Oh,
yeah, wife works in George Street Primary.
Thank you. Councillor Thomas.
I have a grandson at a grandson at Cumbrawn High and the Governor at Nant Celyn School.
Thank you. Councillor Watkins.
I'm a Governor at Our Lady of the Angels Primary School and Cumbrawn High School.
Thank you very much, all. Takes us to the agenda item 3, which is the minutes of the meeting held on the 12th of February 2026. Just to remind members, these minutes relate to the report we received on the Local Authority School Improvement Service, LASIS, and summer outcomes. Members, do you approve these minutes as an accurate record? Thank you, they are approved. Takes us to the action sheet. Can I hand over to Geraint for a quick update?
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, just to remind members that the first two actions have been completed, and we're just waiting for the third one. But like I said last time, as soon as I've got that, I'll forward that on to all of you.
Thank you, Geraint. Agenda item 5, which is the learner progression and cluster working. Oh, apologies. Could you please confirm that if you have any questions or you're happy to note the action sheet? Fine, thanks for that. Agenda item 5, the learner progression and cluster working. The purpose of this report is to explain what approaches are being taken within Torfaen to develop learner progression pathways and how this aligns to cluster development activity. Before we commence discussions, I would like to welcome the officers to the meeting. Could we quickly go around the screen and the table and team for everyone to introduce themselves? Shall we start with Jason?
Thank you, Chair. Jason O'Brien, Strategic Director, Children and Families.
Andy?
Bardar Baub, Andy Rothwell, Head of Learning and Achievements.
Thank you. Andrew?
Bardar Andrew Powell, Director of Education.
Thank you. Karen?
Bardar, everybody. Karen Scott Woodhouse, Principal School Improvement Partner for Torbind.
Thank you. James?
Good morning, James Kent, Assistant Director, Local Authority School Improvement Service.
Thank you. Claire?
Good morning, Claire Williams, Head of ALN Inclusion and Wellbeing.
Thank you very much. And John? John? John is frozen. I'll introduce John Tushingham. I'm not sure if it's a designation, but he's back. He just moved his head. John?
Hi all, John Tushingham, Head of Resources and Planning. Sorry, I've had a couple of occasions with freezing this morning.
Yeah, you froze a bit there. Okay. Welcome all anyway. So that takes us to agenda item 5, the learner progression and cluster. On behalf of the committee, may I thank the head teacher, staff and pupils at Green Meadow Primary School for our very informative recent visit, which had proved really useful in preparing for today's meeting. Members have all read the report, and so we will head straight over to the questions unless anyone would like to make any introductory comments beforehand. No? We're all happy to go straight into questions? Yeah, thank you. I think we can hear some music coming somewhere. No? We usually have a taxi. Anyway, we've got music this morning. The first question is relating to 3.1 and is Councillor Mark Jones. Would you like to ask your question, please?
Councillor Jones, I think you're on mute.
Please. Sorry?
Sorry, you were on mute.
Give us a minute, Councillor Jones. I think
Right.
I've got
Sorry.
my pages mixed up.
Mr Hall's going to come down first and then we'll go into...
Oh, yes. Apologies.
Okay. Right,
No, Mark.
Sorry.
We've got a member of the public in who's going to ask a question this morning. Okay, so I'm going to bring him down first so that he's able to shoot off and we can get on with our business. So before we head to the members' questions, I'm pleased to confirm we have a question from the member of the public. I'd like to invite Mr Craig Hall to join us from the public gallery, please. Thank you. There we go. Welcome, Mr Hall. If you'd like to ask your question.
Yeah, good morning. What learning provisions is in place for a child who is out of school for an extended period of time?
Thank you, Mr Clark. Andy Rothwell, you want to come in first?
Yeah, thank you. A good question, Mr Hall there. So, this is very much on a case-by-case basis and would be sort of driven by individual learner needs at that particular time. But just as for a range of examples, really, so we do have some children who are currently in the Grange or in other hospitals within the Torbind area, and we'd be able to provide some medical or online tuition for them. So that's provided primarily via the pupil referral unit. So we've got an online tutor who provides medical tuition for those pupils. We've got pupils who have got a diagnosed anxiety need, and again there's an online tuition that's provided for those particular pupils. so to support them. Again, that's primarily provided by the PRU. We've got some children across Torvine who are on modified days, so they might have been out of school for a period of time, and we might be using a modified day, which is primarily driven by the school or produced by the school, a plan based around a particular need, and again that's working with school, parents and local authority to gradually reintegrate a pupil back into school after a period of absence, and that might include we've got in some of our secondary schools, they provide some online tuition and then some visits to school as a way of supporting a child back into school. Of course, we've got a cohort within Torvine of electively home-educated pupils who have been out of school for perhaps more than a year. I mean, that's a parent-led decision, and we've got a process around that, but the parent picks up responsibility for educating those children, so there are EHE pupils. But I think primarily the school is the most important place in terms of accessing any support. So for a child who's been out of a school setting for an extended period of time, the initial starting point really would be to make contact with school, and then from there the school can then think about what is the needs of a particular learner and how they might be able to broker some support from, for example, a local authority. So that might come through our ALN team, inclusion team. It might come through the EWS team as well. So the EWS team, the Education Welfare Service, might step in and look at how they can provide support for a learner who's been out of school for a period of time. That might be looking at other agencies, outreach, or other language and supports organisations who might be able to provide some support for those learners. But primarily, you think, get the child back into school, or to help support a child who's been out of school for an extended period of time. School is the starting point. Pick up that conversation with school, and they can act as a broker, and the LA can step in and support around that. So I hope that kind of answers your question. It depends very much on the case, but we do have a range of options to support children.
Thank you, Andy. Jason?
Just very briefly, Chair, I know I mentioned this at the last scrutiny panel. Obviously, Andy's highlighted the education and local authority and the school services that are available there. There's also, I mentioned, as I said on the last occasion, Snap Cymru, which can act as strong advocates for parents and can really, I guess, resolve any challenges with support required for children who aren't in school at any particular time.
As a supplementary to that, can I ask if that Snap Cymru details are available for parents?
They are. They're available online, easily accessible from parents, and with parental permission as well, the local authority can make referrals to Snap Cymru for that advocacy support.
Thanks for that. Any other supplementary to that? Thank you, Mr. Hall. Do you have anything that you didn't understand about that answer?
No, I don't, sorry. I do have a supplementary that obviously I have changed it now, that I would obviously like to ask. Does the local authority have a duty of care to learning provisions, and could it be explained what these are?
Yeah, I think we can take that one, can we? A duty of care. Anybody going to answer that? Andy?
Just start with, do you mean a duty of care to learning provisions as in schools? No, we've got a duty of care to make sure that children are educated.
Sorry, a duty of care to a child to support his education needs.
Yeah, I think that's kind of what I was just talking about, depending on the need of the situation. So if a child, for example, was in the Grange Hospital as one example, and they needed support because, you know, they're in hospital for a reason, but they can continue to be educated, that's where we step in and offer the online medical tuition. Absolutely, we've got that duty.
Can I just comment that, you know, we do have a certain amount of duty of care, but parental responses are priority. Yeah. Thank you.
Just to add as well, I mean, in terms of duty of care, that can be multifaceted, can't it? I think Andy's referenced some of the contacts that the local authority would have with the parent throughout different scenarios. Again, EWS being a key link there. So that I think that's how we would administer that duty of care, through having that level of contact or support, providing a level of contact to parents.
Any supplementary from anyone? Thank you, Mr. Hall. Thank you for your visit. There we go. Apologies for my preempting the questions earlier. May I invite members to ask officers the questions as per the order agreed during the pre-agenda meeting. So we take question one. Apologies, Councillor Jones. Would you like to ask your question now, please?
Yes, thank you, Chair. This is relevant to paragraph 3.1. And it is, are you satisfied with the level of horizontal collaboration that has been undertaken in Torvine? And does this include primary schools as well as secondary schools, please?
Well, we got Karen.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, the horizontal collaboration between the secondary schools has been informal, I would say, and ongoing for some time. We've started to make that a little bit more formal recently with our peer partnership pilot. So that means that we have all Torvine secondary schools now working in partnership with at least one other within the local authority to consider very carefully one very specific aspect of teaching and learning that they want to focus on, that schools choose themselves, and then invite colleagues from other schools and also from LACES to join them to do a self-evaluation on that. That's where it's becoming slightly more formal now, as opposed to the more informal visits that have taken place. So schools have always had that collaboration, that horizontal collaboration. We're just working with them and supporting now to make sure that there's real impact of those visits and schools get what they need from them. In terms of the primary, again, there's lots and lots of informal collaborations that go on between primary schools. We have one cluster who is piloting that vertical collaboration for us at the moment, using the same peer partnership model of schools choosing a very specific focus that they want some support with, and then cluster colleagues going in and helping them sort of gather the information and the evidence that they want, and putting a report together that really helps the school to focus on their next steps.
Thank you, Karen. Councillor
Yeah,
Jones?
thanks. Yeah, fine, thank you very much.
Thank you. No other further comments? Question 2, Councillor Cowles.
Thank you, Chair. This is in relation to paragraph 3.2. Are there any aspects of the cluster transition plans in Torvine where confidence is lower? And if so, what support is being put in place to strengthen them?
Run again. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I'm sure my colleague James might join me to answer some part of this. So we are very confident that all of the cluster plans, the Torvine clusters, are where they need to be and that they meet statutory requirements. There are, of course, some clusters who are further afield in their work. You know, that's a natural state. That would be the same for schools. There are some schools, you know, who are perhaps in better positions than others at the moment, but we are confident within the local authority and the School Improvement Service that all cluster plans are, you know, meet statutory requirements, and that they're effective in moving forward that learner progression from primary into secondary.
Andrew?
Thank you, Chair. One thing we picked up in the spring term was governors' oversight of these cluster plans, and particularly their monitoring of the actions within them. So it actually came as a suggestion from the Cwmbran High cluster that it became a standard agenda item on the full governing body meetings. So that will be happening from the summer. I think it's a really good idea. Andy, Karen and I were all part of a meeting with the Cwmbran High Cluster Chairs of Governors where this was discussed, and it was a real collective endeavour to actually make sure that the cluster planning and transition was strengthened. So it's helpful that actually that's impacted on our a strategy across the whole of Torfaen.
Thank you, Andrew. James?
Just to reiterate the point that Karen made, Councillor Cowles, in respect to your question, we are confident that the plans will meet the statutory requirement, and what we've started to see over the past year is that there's an increasing focus around key aspects. So rather than trying to focus on too many pieces of activity, they're increasingly sharp and focused on particular elements of teaching to support that progression, which I know we've outlined in the paper.
Thank you, Liam. Question 3, Victoria Hall. Oh, sorry.
Can I just sort of just ask a quick question? Obviously now the cluster working, right, it's now statutory, I believe, yes? And you mentioned about the plans that are in place and the confidence you have about these plans. But are you confident that we're not just talking the talk, but we are really walking the walk as well, if that makes sense? That it's not just on paper, that it's actually happening in reality on the ground?
Andy?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it kind of bridges into something I was just going to follow up from what James talked about there. So yesterday we had the Torfaen Association of School Governors meeting, which I think a number of people here were part of. We had a presentation there following on from a previous presentation from a cluster of schools. So it was the Aberystwyth cluster. In this instance, it was Sarah Truelove from Comfortable, who presented the actual work that they've been doing as a cluster around mathematical development. They were able to show us lots of resources that have been developed, which were accessible for parents to help parents better understand how maths is consistently taught across the Aberystwyth cluster, which was really, really useful. And then usefully, and probably most importantly, Sarah and the team were able to talk about actually how this had all impacted on two things: pupil outcomes at individual year groups, so in year 5, year 6 into year 7, but also how there was now consistency in the teaching of maths across the entire cluster. So children transitioning from year 6 into year 7 were able to, weren't being disadvantaged. They weren't stopping and picking up something new in year 7. There was just a continuous flow of process. It was a really powerful example, Councillor, of how cluster working has developed effectively in Torfaen, and it's been great that they were able to come to Torfaen Association of School Governors and share.
Oh, thank you very much, Andy. Good answer.
Thank you. Karen, you want to comment?
Yeah, just to follow on from that, James and I have been very welcomed into all of the clusters this term to do our first report. Our second report, which will be coming now just after the spring term, hopefully will give councillors even more reassurance that actually clusters are doing what they need to do. They are focusing on learner progression, and they do have very specific areas. So our next report now will be able to give, alongside the one that Andy just talked about, really clear examples in every single cluster of where they are working together. They do have that shared vision. They do have very clear priorities for how they want to move forward within their cluster, and I say hopefully some very clear examples of where it's working very, very effectively, and some next steps for each cluster to be able to move forward.
Thank you. And James?
Yeah, and I was going to say something very similar to Karen, actually. I think I'm confident because we visited the clusters. Karen and I have also been invited to other events where head teachers and some of the pupils from the clusters have been participating in some of that activity, and we can see the difference it's made. Andy's given a really good example in terms of some of the work that's going on in one cluster. We've also got other clusters who are working on getting common procedures in maths. We've got some that are working on elements of common assessment and approaches to supporting learners with their independence as well. And as Karen outlines, when we present the next report, you'll see some of those examples really coming through. So we're confident because we've seen and we've worked with the leaders around some of those approaches that they're taking forward.
Thank you for that. Councillor Keats? Yep. Councillor Victoria Hall? Sorry, I just emoted you. Victoria.
Thank you, Chair. Okay, my question relates to 3.2, and I guess it has been covered slightly in this, the answer you just gave, but could you outline how the clusters work together with the LA and LACIS to ensure that all of the expectations between the partnerships are aligned?
Who's taking that one? No hand up. Nobody want to answer that? There we right. And Andrew.
Okay, that's a hard question to answer. Firstly, I'd say we've got the Education Improvement Plan, so that sets out our key priorities. We've got 6 objectives in there, and this is co-constructed with elected members, with school leaders, with officers, and officers from a range of directorates. The first objective in that is about improving outcomes for learners, particularly in literacy and numeracy, and with a real focus on vulnerable and disadvantaged learners. So the expectation is that that's reflected in all school development plans as well, because it's something we've co-constructed. At the Governors Association last night, we talked about the objectives, key actions and performance measures for next year, and we've agreed that. So there was a significant consultation over the autumn. We've checked our draft plan with both the Head Teacher Strategy Group and the Association of Governors last night. So now that will be shared with everyone in April. So that's setting the framework for our priorities. That then aligns with the LACIS business plan. And the expectation is that then all school leaders align their school development plans. So we've got a shared framework of our priorities. Of course, there's got to be some quality assurance, and there's also flexibility within individual schools because everyone will have slightly different priorities. But I hope that sends out the policy and planning framework we have.
Thank you, Karen. Oh, Andy Rothwell, sorry.
Yeah, thank you. Just building on what Andrew's talked about there, so we've also then reflected in sort of challenge sessions. So we've got our continued improvement group, we've got our MER, so that's the monitoring, evaluation and reporting calendar and cycle, where reports are brought in and we'll challenge ourselves as an education directorate, but we'll also get external challenge from a continued improvement group. And then, of course, we've got a wholesale evaluation day that brings together head teachers, officers from the local authority, LACIS, and also a representation of elected members, Councillor Clark in particular. And again, we'll just review collectively what's been going on, take the temperature, as it were, of how we're achieving, how we're progressing towards those priorities, and then, you know, if gaps are coming up, then we'll fill them and we'll adjust the future plan. And then, of course, the most important one is where we are right now, which is how do we know we're on the right page and are we going in the right direction through sessions like these where we get further challenge.
Thank you, Andy. Claire.
Hi. And in relation to ALN inclusion and wellbeing, whilst the work that we're doing with ALNCos might not always form part of their formal cluster plans in the context that we've been talking about so far, we've mentioned at previous scrutinies around ALN that we do encourage our ALNCos to work clusters at every forum, and we work closely with LACIS to make sure that our documentation and the way that we report is aligned. So an example of that recently is where we've had ALNCos working in their clusters to start mapping what their universal provision offer looks like across their cluster, so we can try to achieve better consistency. And in doing that, we are using the LACIS teaching and learning strategy as the basis for future work, where we want to develop that further and an inclusive practice toolkit using good examples from around Torfaen. So we've got an iteration of that already, but future work is using the clusters of ALNCos to inform that.
Thank you, Claire. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Question 4, which is Councillor Janet Jones.
Thank you, Chair. My question is related to paragraph 3.3. How confident are you that leadership within schools are engaging well in their cluster groups? And secondly, are there any issues or gaps where further attention or support may be beneficial?
Andrew.
If I start, I suspect Karen will come in, because we've just over a year ago, we recognised there were some clusters that weren't meeting regularly, and their cluster working needed development. So there were some individual conversations that were had, both with chairs of governors, with head teachers, and at cluster meetings about the importance of this work, and that as a local authority, we did expect that to be prioritised. That's what's led to us setting thematics in the autumn and the spring term around the quality of cluster planning and about the progress of learners as a result of their planning. Karen and I have spoken earlier today, and we've got examples where actually that's really shifted, and also where perhaps work was happening that wasn't being celebrated. So with that introduction, I think perhaps Karen could give a few more examples.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Chair. I would agree wholeheartedly with Andrew. I would say at this time last year, we were not confident that all leadership in all schools was engaging in the way that it should do in cluster working. However, I think through the last 12 months, certainly through the thematic reports and that focus on cluster working, it has supported schools to see the importance of it. We had some clusters that were doing exceptionally well anyway, and we can show those as really good examples now of, you know, really highly effective practice. I'm not sure whether it's appropriate to name those clusters at the moment. But, you know, we've talked about the West Mon cluster, for example, and the work that they've been doing around their peer partnership and around their maths. Some really strong practice in many of our clusters now, where the head teachers are very, very focused on that learner progression. James and I, you know, James has already said, we've been invited. The joy of this now is that we're being invited in. We're not pushing our way in. We're actually being invited in. Clusters are very keen for us to go back and, you know, to show us what they're doing. We're supporting them to write cluster reports. So as well as the local authority impact report, clusters now are writing their own evaluative reports that show where they are within that learner progression and what they want to do next. You know, and again, another example of that would be in St Albans, where they've worked really hard on writing and on moving away really from sort of genres of writing to purposes of writing, and making sure that that is clear right across the cluster. So they're now working on, I suppose, learning objectives that help them to really support children's writing for purpose and audience, rather than just to practice a particular text type. That's working really strongly. They're engaging in professional learning with our curriculum partners, and we're seeing now the fruits of that labour through the reports that they're doing. Cwmbran is another example. They've really focused on reading. They've come together, they've got really good, rich reading data that they're now putting into a report to share with us, to show sort of the strategies that they've agreed on this year and the implementation of those strategies right across all the schools, and how that's really impacting on the pupils, because they've recognised that pupils going into year 7, many of the reading ages of those pupils aren't enabling them to access the curriculum from year 7, 8 and 9. So we've got lots and lots of examples, and I would say now, and I again, hopefully James would corroborate this, we are confident that all leaders in all schools are engaging at least appropriately in their cluster working. Most of them are engaging extremely well.
Thank you, Chair.
Andy?
Yeah, just to add as well, of course, leadership isn't just about a head teacher, it's also about governors and governance in school. Over the period of last year, I'm sure I've said this to previous scrutinies, we've run cluster governor training, which all clusters have engaged with across Torvine. That's been really powerful in bringing people together, building those networks across governors, groups of governors, building those networks and relationships, which enables and facilitates cluster working at a school level. And I think in some of the best examples, clusters, as an example, across the Killiog cluster are now running their own cluster governor sessions on a regular basis. They held one recently where they brought all of the cluster primary school governors into the comprehensive school. They did a big walk around the school so all the governors could understand the material of the building, and they then spoke about planning, cluster plans, and it was a really rich challenge session there for governors to be involved with. So it isn't just about head teachers. Of course, that's really, really important, but it does also include governors and their role in bringing the cluster together as well.
Thank you. I've just got a supplementary. Are all data collections aligned, or are schools collecting different data pertaining to their schools? Karen? Sorry.
Different clusters are collecting different data because they've got very different areas that they're focusing on. So, as I've already said, Cwmbran, for example, are focused at a cluster level on very specific reading data that they've agreed at key points through the year. If we gave another example, Aberystwyth, for example, are very focused on their numeracy and their maths data because that's their particular focus. So all schools collect data on an individual level. It will very much depend on the cluster plan as to what collective data they will collect and what data they're using, to look at a particular progression within their cluster.
Thank you. That was my point. Whatever lesson it was, whether it was collecting similar data or not. Okay. Andrew, sorry.
Thank you, Chair. That issue you raise, I think, is a challenge for us. It's something that's being discussed at a national level about how, within curriculum for Wales, schools are able to assess, their assessment strategies are independent. And until the end of Key Stage 4, as a local authority, we've got very limited data that's standardised that we can use to look at the outcomes and progression of learners. So I think it's a really important point you've made, just because that presents such a challenge to us.
Thank you. Victoria.
Thank you, Chair. Okay, so my question is still in relation to 3.3 and is what support is provided to new leaders within schools in order to maintain the progress around learner progression and cluster working by their predecessors? And I guess I'm thinking also linking back to what Andy said around different levels of leadership as well and school governing bodies.
Andy?
Yeah, I'll start, but I think there's going to be a couple of other people who want to jump in around this. So there's a range of support for new leaders coming into Torvine schools. So, I mean, in the first instance, the local authority runs an annual new and acting head teacher induction programme that runs across a year. That'll cover all elements of school life, from HR to finance. There'll be an element from EWS, etc., etc. So that covers all of that side of things. We also run, as part of that programme, any new head teacher coming in. So I'm going to give an example here without naming names. Head teacher came into a school about a year ago. We identified that it would be really useful for her to have a head teacher buddy, essentially. So that's a serving head teacher. Ideally, when we do that, we try and pick somebody from within the cluster. So we'll approach a couple of heads within the cluster and say, are you in a position, workload-wise at the moment, to support this new head teacher who's coming in, which is exactly what happened in that situation. So straight away, those transition points and support across the cluster, that's enabled and is really useful in building bridges and forming relationships. There's generally a handover period, so when a new head starts and a head teacher is transitioning out, there will be a handover period, be that a couple of keeping in touch days, so that information isn't lost as well. We've already talked about governors, so the cluster governor training, but there's also bespoke governor training that's offered through LACIS, and they can support governing bodies in any manner of areas, really. But one often that we work around is self-evaluation and improvement planning, which links to the cluster planning. So there's a range of support there. You can see Claire's also got a hand up.
Claire?
Hi, yeah, and just to add to that, as you've rightly pointed out, leadership is more than just the head teacher. So in terms of that wider middle leadership development, the ALNCO forum is a forum for those ALNCOs who are middle leaders. But we also run as an ALN induction session for the new head teacher sessions that Andy mentioned. We also run that separately as new to ALNCO induction at the start of the year, so we identify any new staff in schools taking on that responsibility. There's also the LRB lead network, which we see very much as that middle leadership development as well for those who are, often it is the ALNCO, but there will be staff in learning resource spaces who are also leaders in their own right, leading those settings. But we've offered that sort of bespoke support around ALN leadership as well. So sometimes we've dropped into a school to support them with a review. Maybe that's been around their delegated mainstream funding and how they're allocating that. And some specific examples, not just around standards, but also around wellbeing support, where there've been critical incidents in schools, for example, to support that leadership to continue, despite perhaps, you know, the turbulence that's happening in the school at the time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Victoria. Question 6 is relating to 3.3, and it's my question. The report highlights a potential risk that leaders may focus more on completing transition activities than evaluating their impact on pupil outcomes. What specific outcome measures are being used to demonstrate that cluster working is improving learner progression in Torfaen? And what evidence is available to show this impact?
Yeah, happy to pick up at the initial bit of that, Chair, if that's okay. So I'll go back to the Aberystwyth example yesterday in terms of capturing their impact of cluster working. They looked at the numeracy data from the national from the national numeracy procedural test and also the national numeracy reasoning tests. So their focus there was reviewing that data to look at progression and improvement. So that informed them quite clearly about what was working around the activity that they'd undertaken and then the benefits and changes to pupil outcomes. So that was a really strong example of that. Again, I think other examples, Karen's already alluded to examples within the Cwmbran cluster around reading. So there is data that is available there to take it back to the pupil. What difference are we making to the pupil as a result of this cluster work? Demonstrable examples with the Aberystwyth cluster.
Thank you. Karen?
Thank you, Chair. I think historically this was the issue in clusters. The plans tend to be quite vague, quite large, and schools were very busy doing. They weren't necessarily measuring the impact of what they were doing. So again, the work that we've been doing on the impact reports that we've been writing, I think are really supporting schools to think very, very strategically and very clearly about what they're doing, why they're doing it, and is it having the impact. Where it's really successful, then schools have got agreed measures. That could be national data, so national maths, national reading data. It could be agreed sort of in-house data assessments. They do things like accelerated reader, the star reader, the star maths. It might be about moderation. So we're seeing lots of schools going back to bringing their work together and looking at it collectively and making those agreed judgments around learner progression. That's really successful in a couple of clusters where, we've got groups of staff coming together, so perhaps year groups, and looking at particular aspects of work, say quality of writing or quality of numeracy, particularly numeracy, and looking at different work in different books in different schools and saying, yeah, this is what we think is a really good example of where this child should be at this particular point. In their learning journey. So there are lots of varying ways in which we can have those measures, but it's about how they how they record that and what it does to move them on to the next steps. And hopefully that's where James and I are coming in and really helping them to streamline and be strategic in the impact that it's having.
Okay, James?
Yes, I think Karen said many of the things that I would have said, but I think there's a couple of things. Data, we talked about some of the kind of sort of the hard data, if you like, some of the reading data, some of the maths data. There's also a lot of other information that schools are collecting around the point of transition and into the autumn term and learners transition in terms of things like pupil voice activities, parental surveys, which help to build a rich picture of the difference that some of those that transition work has made, in addition to some of the work they're doing around teaching and learning as well. I think the other thing that Karen and I are trying to work with clusters to do is be really clear about what the intended impact is when they're doing their planning. So what would we expect to see over a period of time in terms of some of those changes? So you know, this will be a picture that will develop, I think, over a much longer period of time.
Thank you, Claire.
And for pupils with ALN, there would be an enhanced transition, and part of that transition process, particularly when we're talking about children moving from one specialist set into another, where they would have a local authority IDP, there would be a review, you know, when that pupil goes through that period of transition, and that is how we would be looking at monitoring the outcomes for learners with ALN through their IDP monitoring.
Thank you very much. Any supplementary? Councillor Keats, question 7.
Thank you, Chair. My question relates to 4.1. We're aware that LASS's local authority schools improvement service has developed a range of professional learning and documentation that aligns to Welsh Government's guidance and expectations that are linked to developing effective cluster partnerships. However, is best practice around cluster working also being sought from national and international examples? Who wants that one?
Are we looking outside the box?
Hands up. You wait until you hear the supplementary question.
Andrew.
Yeah. Well,
No.
Actually, Councillor, I'm going to bow out and let James go first, because it's his area.
James.
Okay, so so in terms of the what international evidence fed into the guidance that was developed, so one of the supplementary documents you've got is the local authority guidance around this work, and this was developed alongside Professor McWaters, who has done a lot of work on collaboration. So the principles and all of the kind of the things that are built in there have been built from not just what's going on inside Torfaen, but also what's going on across other local authorities within our partnership, but also some of what Mick has seen internationally in terms of developing some of that. So we do make sure that we think about collaborations more broadly, and where there are good examples being shared in other parts of the partnership, we'll use that as part of the support in development work we do. But what I would say is that there is some of the best practice we are now seeing in terms of this work is happening in some of the Torfaen clusters because of the focus that we've got, I think, with the local authority around developing this. So yes, we've always got an eye internationally, we've always got an eye on the research, we've always got an eye on what's happening in terms of collaborations, but I'm confident that the information that we're sharing really supports the schools in having kind of access to the best advice and guidance in terms of getting some of these collaborations working properly and effectively.
Thank you. Karen.
Thank you, Chair. Again, going back to the peer partnerships where we're working with our secondary and one of our primary clusters, we're working there with Maggie Farrar, so she is renowned for her work on effective cluster working and collaborations. We're bringing her in. She's worked with head teachers to create the pilot handbook. She's also worked with the staff who are leading on this in schools, so they tend to be the senior leaders and the middle leaders, again, to really understand what it's about and to make sure that they get the very best out of this pilot and that we learn from it and we move forward. So where we can, people like Professor McWaters, Maggie Farrar, we are bringing in those experts to work alongside us and to make sure that we're doing the best we can to support the schools.
Thank you, Claire.
Hi, yeah, a couple of points really. I think, as you said, sometimes by the time this guidance lands with us, it has already, as James said, been through sometimes that process of looking at the local and the national and sometimes international learning. So I think that comes through the guidance anyway. Having been parts of lots of working groups in the past with James and others, where that's been things that we've been tasked with, is looking at the data and the research. But I think it's also just to offer that reassurance that some of the work that we're doing, so for example, the work that I've done with ALNCOs recently about trying to define what does universal provision generally look like across Torfaen, that's been informed by national working. So there's been an ALN legislative review, and part of the work of that nationally has been to try to define that. That's still work in progress, but we're trying to get ahead of the curve really in Torfaen by starting that piece of work locally. And then another example, I think, is where we've linked up with the HDRC, the Health Determinants Research Collaboration. So there's lots of different strands of work going on at the moment in the Education Department, EOTUS being one of them. So again, that's not about cluster working in the context that we're talking about now, but there's lots of definitions of clusters as well. So looking at our cluster of secondary schools together, we're trying to do a piece of work around EOTUS, but we've linked up with the Health Determinants Research Collaboration, who, if you like, can support us with that research aspect of looking at what does practice locally, nationally and internationally look like to inform that work.
Thank you, Claire. Andy?
Thanks. Part of the question as well, I think, was around sharing of practice. And one of the things that's coming up, well, one's happened this year, but it's going to happen next year, is the LACES are organising a head teacher conference, and there's going to be a strong focus in the next conference around teaching and learning, and naturally that's going to bring into it cluster learning, well, what we're talking about now, learning progression and pathways. So there's going to be a really good opportunity for Torfaen schools to share some of the work that they've engaged with around learning progression cluster working through that forum. I think importantly, historically, those head teacher conferences have been very much sort of driven and organised by the local authority and LACES. The most recent one that happened was entirely organised and driven by head teachers for head teachers, and we facilitated that. And that's absolutely the spirit that we're trying to work with the next one.
Okay, Andy. Andrew?
Thank you, Chair. So building on Andy's point actually about how the schools are driving some of the research. So as an example, Oscar Panteg obtained funding for a research trip to Tokyo to look at effective language immersion and language development, particularly the view of how English is learned in a Japanese-speaking environment and principles that could be applied to Welsh immersion within Torfaen. So that was a Welsh Government project, a Welsh Government funded project. The findings that, with several research papers that were presented to the Cabinet Secretary, and Oscar Panteg are now presenting that to the Welsh immersion networks across Wales. The head teacher, Oscar Panteg, also sits on the board of the Association of Study for Primary Education. So this is a national charity that's got representation from the 4 countries in the UK. And again, he's leading work there, sharing research and also visiting other parts of the UK to see effective practice and then bringing it back to the region. So I think that's something we can be really proud of within Torfaen, that we're not just receiving, but actually we're developing and sharing findings.
Well done. Thank you. Claire?
And I just wanted to add really the point I made earlier. I think what we're trying to do with the work, for example, with the HDRC, that the question is a really good one. Are we looking at practice outside? But what we're also trying to do is making sure that we're evidence informed then, and rather than maybe we may have made decisions in the past by looking at what is a neighbour in LA doing and trying to replicate perhaps something that we're seeing somewhere else. And that is part of the conversation, but it is also about looking at what does the evidence show us about whether that approach is right or wrong, and not adopting things just because others are doing them, but actually looking at the impact that they have in.
Thanks, Keith.
Thank you very much for that. wasn't expecting such a long answer, to be honest.
There you
But can I'm in a privileged position, I think, being relatively new to the Education Committee. I can still ask dumb questions. Right, so I'm going to try another one now. My take on it's been really encouraging to see lots of activity that's taking place. And I think, James, you mentioned the bespoke training, expert advice coming from Professor Mike Waters. Yeah. My question would be but how are we actually measuring the real improvements in teaching and pupil outcomes? What I'm saying lots of outcome, yes, but how are we measuring it? Lots of things you're doing, which is great to see and very, very encouraging. How are we measuring it? And if I'm cut across somebody else's question, I do apologise.
I think that's called reflective moments when you ask the question, isn't it?
Do you want to take this first one?
I'm sure Andrew will come in and talk about the education improvement plan, but Andrew's mentioned that earlier. That's our sort of our bread and butter, if you like. So that's where our KPIs and our success criteria would be defined. So, you know, there's a variety of success criteria in that, depending on the objective that we're looking at, which might involve data, it might involve outcomes, it might involve provision being developed. So I'd say that's would be the go-to place to find the success criteria. But it isn't just us sitting in a room on our own defining that. As Andrew said, that's been a collaborative piece of work. I'm sure, Andrew, you could probably articulate that better than I just did.
No, basically you took the words out of my mouth, Claire. So we've worked really hard to have effective performance measures within the education improvement plan. It is a challenge in terms of having standardised outcomes across all schools, because like Karen said, some schools will be using different programmes to potentially track an improvement in reading, improvement in literacy, numeracy. But what we've endeavoured to put within the plan are measures that can be applied to all schools. For learner outcomes linked to attainment, we are heavily reliant on GCSE outcomes. So looking at the literacy, numeracy, science scores that are attained at individual school level. But we are looking at factors like rates of exclusions, whether they're fixed term or permanent, the number of modified days within a school, the attendance rates, whether school individual learners are meeting their IDP targets. So I would just direct you to the education improvement plan for the overview of the scores that we've used.
James?
Yeah, so in respect of then individual work that clusters do, we are looking at making sure there is a clear understanding of that impact, and that will be some of that data, some of the literacy and numeracy data, of which most clusters are using, albeit slightly different standardised tests around reading ages, numerical proficiency, and so on. So we will be looking at data to see, have these modifications to the way that we're teaching. So if we're all teaching multiplication in a common way in maths, what impact is that having? If we are, and we've seen a really good example recently in West Mon, where they've got a common approach to something called bar modelling, which seems to be improving then algebra, so how pupils are able to do algebra in year 7 and 8 in the secondary school. So where we are trying to set those kind of priorities out, we are trying to be really clear about what will we expect to see in terms of the data, but also in terms of some of those kind of, as I mentioned earlier, some of the softer measures. So are pupils more confident? Are they experiencing transition in a more positive way as time goes on? What are they saying to us about that? Because we know there is that that link between their well-being and their ability to learn as well. So I think we have to look at the whole package of measures through that, but also staff. Are staff more confident in those things? Because one of the great things about getting clusters together is teachers learning from each other. So actually, I was in the Cross Achilleo cluster a couple of weeks ago. The numeracy lead in the secondary school, working with the primary numeracy leads around some of the aspects of work that they found challenging. So are staff feeling more confident in some of their practice as a result? Because that will impact on pupils down the line. So I think one of the things we're trying to do is look at that breadth of information, which will ultimately then lead to those improved outcomes as time goes on. So hopefully that was helpful.
Karen?
Thank you, Chair. In addition to this, and it's not necessarily about cluster working, but if we're talking about measuring progress, then we make sure that the local authority have an overview of all of their schools and the progress of their pupils within that. So we provide a progress and standards report on an annual basis, and that will look at key skills and the progress of all pupils across all schools in how well they're doing, particularly in their literacy and numeracy, because that's a clear focus. I think over the last couple of years as well, as a local authority, we've had a very clear focus on the basic skills really. So we've also looked at progressive literacy for all pupils across Torvine schools. We've looked in detail at progressive numeracy for all pupils, and we're currently looking at digital skills as well. And we revisit those over sort of a 2-year programme, a rolling programme. So we have got a real handle on where different schools are right across the authority and the progress that their pupils are making. And that's based on an awful lot of first-hand evidence. So we'll look at ESTIN reports, we'll look at what the school improvement partner is saying about that particular school, we'll look at national test data, you know, a wide range of evidence to be able to give those precise measurements to local authority.
Andrew?
Thank you. I'll just talk a little bit about how we're managing this within the departments, because this has been something we focused on a lot over the last few years. Ultimately, we want better outcomes for learners, but often there's a risk that you start to look at how many people participated in a course. Did they enjoy it? So we use what's called the Gusky model, which it starts off firstly, did they turn up? Did they rate the day? But then we revisit and we think, well, actually, what changes to your practice did you make over the next 6 months? Was that embedded? Then what difference in the outcomes did you see for learners, perhaps over the following 6 months? So our evaluation is based on more of a longitudinal study rather than just I participated in a course. This has been quite a journey for us. I wouldn't say we're completely there yet, but that's our strategy for making sure that whatever we're doing is impactful for learners, because that is our key reason for being here.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Councillor Keats. Councillor Watkins, question 8.
Thank you, Chair. Moving on to section 4.3, although the 6 clusters are understandably at different stages in their journeys, are there any concerns about the pace of progress with any of them?
Karen?
At this point in time, no. If you'd asked me this 6 months, 12 months ago, I would have said, yes, we have concerns around 2 particular clusters. But actually, the local authority focus has really helped and supported us to get into clusters and to be able to work with leaders, you know, not just head teachers, but leaders at all levels. So there has been a considerable pace of progress, I would say, in 2 particular cluster schools, clusters of schools that are possibly not where the others are, but are we confident that they're now on the right pathways? Are we confident that they're choosing the right priorities? Are we confident that they are measuring the outcome of their work appropriately? At this point, then I would absolutely say yes. Yes, we are.
Okay, Jane?
Yes, that's good to hear. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. You answered some of my next question, but it's really about the risks. So it relates to 4.3 again. What risks arise from the variability in cluster progress, and how are the LA and LACES mitigating potential inequity for learners across Torvine? And are there any anticipated timescales around achieving parity of progress? So when do we all get to the same stage? Don't be shy. Andrew.
Okay, I'll start. So I touched earlier about that the fact cluster plans are now on a standard agenda item on full governing body meetings. That's going to be a key tool for us, because ultimately it is the governor's that have the overview of the day-to-day work within the school. We dip sample minutes of governing body meetings. This will be a focus to check that actually there is a purposeful discussion around the cluster plans, and where there are concerns that it's not being progressed or that not being discussed, we will pick up individual conversations with individual schools and clusters.
Fine, thank you. Karen?
Thank you, Chair. I think we've just got to be mindful that we've got a heavy focus on cluster at the moment, and James and I are supporting all clusters as well as we're able. I think, you know, potential risk is once we've completed the spring term impact report and we're perhaps focusing on something else, that there is a danger maybe that cluster working in a couple of clusters might fall away. So I think we've just got to keep it on the ball. We've just got to keep revisiting, going back, you know, making sure that clusters know that, you know, we are here, we will attend any meeting that they want us to, you know, we will help and support in any way. But that could be a potential risk that once the spotlight is taken away from cluster working, that, you know, the progress that they're making may go backwards a little bit. Hopefully not, because actually they can see the benefits of it. But yeah, that would be a slight risk for me. Timescales, parity of progress. I think it's you know, everything is on an individual basis, and it's not a great answer, I know, because it's sort of passing the buck a little bit, but actually they are all at very different levels and they are looking at very different things. We're very confident at the moment that each cluster has the right priorities, that they are looking at the right things for the right reasons, and the progress that they are all making at least suitable progress towards those priorities. So I don't know that I can answer about the timescales, but if they stay on their current trajectory, then we're confident that each cluster is where they need to be and making the progress that they should be making, and that they have that real focus on their learners.
Thank you, Karen. James?
Yeah, it's a very difficult question to answer, because getting everyone to the same place at the same time when you're talking about potentially 4, 5, 6 different schools within a cluster, we know that I know that from experience working in other clusters and other authorities as well, that when you lose 2 or 3 key leaders at a certain time, that can have an impact on whether a cluster moves forward. So there's all sorts of different things that can influence over time where clusters can get to. I think in the guidance we developed, we've listed a whole load of those things to look out for and support clusters with. And as Karen says, if we keep the focus on that, we can support people through that process. But you know, just to say that it's often quite a dynamic and moving picture. But on the point of difference, I think the fact that different clusters have got slightly different foci at the moment in terms of their work is actually a strength, because what that will allow the local authority to do is to share that practice across the other clusters, and I think that's going to be a point of real benefit. For example, the independence framework being developed in Crossy, and a similar thing going on in St Albans. Everyone can benefit from some of the lessons that are being learnt through that. Likewise, the example Andy gave around Aberystwyth and some of the things we talked about in terms of Westmoreland, there are definitely examples that can be shared for the benefit of everybody to really accelerate and support their development going forward. So yes, there are risks, but there are also great opportunities to the fact they've got these precise foci in slightly different areas.
Good point. Thank you, James. Claire?
Hi. Yeah, I think the work that we're trying to do with ALN codes is around this potential risk. As you said, the risk is that whilst all of our mainstream schools are equally able to provide for the needs of learners with ALN, that can look different sometimes in different schools. So as part of the work that we're doing around that is to try to respect the autonomy, if you like, of each setting, because in answer to the question, when do we achieve parity, I'd argue that we might never achieve complete parity, because each school needs to respond to its own context. So part of the curriculum for Wales is a principle of subsidiarity. The people closest to the community and the school know its needs best. So it will always look slightly different across different schools. But what we're trying to do is bring it back to some common principles. So through professional learning, making sure there's a shared understanding of what a good graduated response looks like. doing some common and shared professional learning around autism and education trust practice, for example, the use of EduKey. So we've got some common principles and shared understanding across schools, whilst also recognising that it will always look slightly differently where schools are meeting the needs of the, individual learners in front of them.
Thank you. Andrew.
Thank you. I just think in terms of risks, like ultimately why we're pushing cluster working is to improve outcomes in literacy and numeracy. And that's not ever going to go away. That's a key purpose of schools. So this is just a mechanism for making sure outcomes improve, and particularly that the gap of attainment between particularly free school meal learners and non-free school meal learners reduces. So I think as long as we keep that in our mind at all points, these are just different strategies towards the same end.
Thank you. Andy?
Yeah, very, very quickly, just Andrew's alluded to it already. Claire often uses the phrase, keep the main thing, and the main thing is absolutely literacy and numeracy, and closing that deprivation gap. And the point of a cluster working ultimately is that shared accountability for a child as they enter school all the way through to the point where they leave school, and keeping the main thing.
I think the point was made last night at the governor training. We're all in it for the same benefit, and that's the benefit of the child, isn't it? Yeah. Okay, thanks for that. Question 10, Councillor Collett-Thomas.
Thank you, Chair. I think some of my questions already been answered. Please could you outline any current cluster initiatives focused on ALN, pupil behaviour or wellbeing, especially those supporting the transition of learners from into years 6 and 7?
Andy.
I think I'm going to probably say something that Claire's going to want to say, but it was going to be about, in particular, around transition for ALN learners, so enhanced transition for ALN learners. That goes on right across the board. All clusters will be involved in that. It might not necessarily be a focus on their cluster improvement plan. It's more a business as usual, making sure that every child has a really smooth and strong transition from whichever primary school they're moving from into their secondary school, and quite often that doesn't start in year 6, that might start in year 5, or even in some clusters or some cases as low as year 4. So I'll probably pass over to Claire to continue that.
Thanks, Andy. Yeah, exactly that. Our summer term 1 ALN Co-Forum will have a slot in there on what does good transition look like generally, because whilst that ALN Co-Forum obviously is for ALN COs who look after all of those children who've been identified with ALN, lots of the work that I'm describing to you around inclusive practice is that general provision as well, and just to that inclusive practice for all. So the enhanced transition piece that Andy talked about, if those pupils who've been identified as being in need of a specialist provision, we've brought that process, the timescales for that process forward quite considerably, so that those outcomes have all been communicated to schools already. That's much, much earlier than it's been in the past. The final decisions in some instances haven't been achieved till sometimes May, June. Those decisions were made by February so that outcomes could be considered by March. So in our LRB network, which we think of as a cluster as well, those professionals are already liaising with each other to organise enhanced transitions for those pupils who will be accessing specialist provision. And I think the question was around examples of things that we're doing to support wellbeing and ALN generally in clusters. So another piece of work that's ongoing at the moment, Dr. Alison Coster is working with an external consultant, for example, to look at EBSNA and focusing on some of the reasons why pupils have perhaps started to stop attending school, and that's been looked at on a cluster basis as well, so that eventually we can support schools with some advice and guidance on some of those perhaps risk factors for that happening.
Thank you. Question 11, Councillor Watkins. Councillor Watkins. Jane. There we go.
Apologies, I was just plugging the cable in. I was losing power. Right, moving on to 4.4. It says the report mentions that 3 clusters in Torfaen are now following a cluster attendance policy. Are the 3 clusters using the same attendance policy, or are there now 3 different cluster-specific versions? Also, is the good practice in this area being shared across other clusters?
Andy?
No. Thank you. I was going to add that into what Claire's just finished off with in relation to the last question, Councillor. So, yeah, we've got 3 clusters where they've developed their own cluster attendance policy, which is great. I've spoken to you about this previously. The benefit of having that cluster attendance policy. Twofold, really. One, from a family's point of view, they understand the processes that the schools that their children will be in from primary through to secondary. There's consistency with that, and that's really helpful from a family's point of view in terms of expectation, knowing what they can get, understanding the process, understanding perhaps if fixed penalty notices might be used, and understanding why. So there's nice consistency with that. Are they the same policy? No. We've got a template example that we're quite happy to work with schools and clusters to develop around a cluster attendance policy. They talk largely to the Welsh Government guidance, and there's consistency there around it, but they're not necessarily exactly the same policy. They might have local tweaks or addendums that just meet the needs of those particular schools. Mentioned one of the other benefits as well is from a school point of view, from a head teacher point of view. It's not then just a head working in isolation, so they're able to, I suppose, if we're working with a family, they can identify or talk with the family about the fact that it's going to be the same. It's the same from our point of view. It's the same. People can't be picked off or isolated, so there's a nice bit of protection there. And then just in terms of sharing good practice, yes. So we run a termly attendance forum, so all schools are invited. That can be a head teacher, deputy head teacher, attendance lead, family engagement officers as well. We held one recently actually in Newin, where we were yesterday. So I think it happened about 2 weeks ago. Within that, Newin Primary School talked about the Westmont approach to developing attendance. Back in the autumn term, we were in Westmont Comprehensive School, and they talked there about some of the work that they're doing at a cluster basis to support EFSM learners and improve their attendance. So there's a really nice forum for schools to share. The next one is up at Aberystwyth in the summer term. There's an open invitation to all elected members. If you want to come along and listen and learn about what's going on from an attendance point of view, you're more than welcome to come along and join the Aberystwyth Cluster Attendance Forum.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. Question 12, Councillor Colette Thomas.
I think some of my questions have already been answered, but I'll just... the clusters following the attendance policy, have we seen any improvements around attendance there? And are all the clusters using the same approach of fixed penalty notices, please?
So have we seen improvements in attendance? Yes, compared to the pandemic times, we're still not back. Repeated message again, I'm afraid, but we're still not back to where we were pre-pandemic, and we know that we've still got a sizable gap between EFSM learners and non-EFSM learners. But yes, we have seen improvements across cluster, and obviously that's based on individual schools. In terms of fixed penalty notices, so that is still down to school governing bodies on a school-by-school basis to agree to using. We don't and we can't enforce that. We do encourage it. It is demonstrable in terms of its impact. It does have an impact in terms of reducing holidays, but generally we're seeing most schools using them, and again the application of how they use that just follows Welsh Government guidance. We're locked into that criteria. We're not able to sort of navigate that process or change that process. It is what it is, I suppose.
And that's the next question, Councillor Thomas.
In relation to the work in the strategy groups, how well attended are these meetings, and are there any resource or capacity challenges within schools that may be affecting attendances?
Andrew.
I can speak to the groups that I'm participating in first. So they are really well attended. There are no patterns of absence from certain schools, and I think we want this to be. They want them to be purposeful agendas. That actually it's working on shared issues of concern or priority. So it's great schools are prioritising attending them from my experience. There are a number of them, and there are some schools that are potentially overrepresented on the working groups. So I've raised this with all the head teachers, also quite regularly with the lead primary and secondary heads, that we've got proportional representation across all schools. Unfortunately, there are still a few schools where there is no representation on some groups, and again, that's been raised regularly because we want all schools to participate in at least one group.
Andy? Oh, Claire, sorry. Claire?
Yeah, I think as Andrew said, the attendance is generally very good, and if we've ever experienced, so for example this term for the first time in the ALN Head Teacher Strategy Group we had an issue with people not being able to attend, but when we looked at that, it's quite a short half term and there were a number of other meetings around about the same time, so I think that's just about us being strategic when there is particularly in the spring term when you have shorter half terms, it's looking at how you can spread the work and make sure you can fit those meetings in, but generally they're very well attended, and I think that, as Andrew said, is because the agenda for the meetings and the activity for some of those strategic groups is often around co-construction of things. So in the ALN Head Teacher Strategy Group in the last academic year, that group supported the co-construction of the changes to the mainstream ALN funding formula and the learning resource-based funding formula. So the group has a vested interest in coming to those meetings because they affect change and policy, for example. In terms of other working groups, so for example, IOTA's working group, or where we've had an IBIS network, if this is a priority that we're really trying to drive and we're trying to affect change across multiple settings, we have supported that sometimes with the release of some funding to support people to attend meetings. So that's the case for the IOTA's working groups, very well attended, and people have been funded to support the release of staff to come.
Thank you, Claire. Andy?
Yeah, everything that Claire has said, absolutely. One of the other nice little bits that we've been able to do with meetings as well is just sometimes occasionally offer the hybrid option, so that just enables members of staff to, if they can't get full release from the school, they're able to join from a hybrid point of view. You get sort of mix there, but again, it's just about purpose, isn't it? There's purpose to the meetings. They're influencing strategy and policy decision-making processes. They're being consulted. And in the example of, for example, the IT head teachers group, they've had a sizable amount of money that they've made and developed a strategy around how they're going to issue it to its schools and the purpose behind issuing it to schools. So that really drives the attendance at those meetings.
Question 14 should have been John Cunningham, but he sent his apologies, so I'll take it. Is it the responsibility of school governing bodies to ratify the cluster plan and to monitor the school progress through the plan? And are you confident that governors have sufficient understanding and capacity in order to achieve this? How are the LA and LACIS supporting this? Karen?
Well, straightforward answer, yes, it is the job, and it is their own responsibility of governing body to make sure that the statutory plans are in place. So that's the same with every school's SDP, as well as the cluster plans. It is the role of the governing body to monitor and to ensure that the school is making progress towards its SDP and also the cluster plans. Are we confident that this is happening? Right across the board, no, we're not. Andrew's already alluded to this, that we're starting to recognise and come across, not in many schools, but in a few schools, that governors haven't often had enough sight of the cluster plans, so they don't really understand the priorities and how schools got to those priorities because they're not involved enough in the process. Are they monitoring it well enough? Again, I'd say there's a job of work to be done around that. But, we've recognised that as a local authority, and we now have plans in place to ensure that we're going to help and support governors to make sure that they are looking at those plans and they are understanding progress that clusters are making, you know, and that they're part and parcel, you know, of that process of identifying the priorities and understanding why particular clusters are working on particular things, you know, and how they can help and support. But we'll put some professional learning on for governors in the sorts of questions that they could and should be asking their cluster head teachers to ensure that they are meeting their statutory requirements.
Thank you, Karen. I think my question 15's been asked and answered, so question 16, Councillor Watkins.
Thank you, Chair. In paragraph 4.12, it states there, the next step is to ensure that expectations for progression within a cluster are comparative to other clusters within and beyond the local authority. This will ensure coherence and equity across the education system. Is there a timeline for this, and when would you expect to see the results of it?
Andrew?
Yeah, I think this is a real challenge for us, and this was part of a conversation yesterday with Welsh Government and Estyn, in that there is no clear mechanism of doing it at the moment. So the conversation was about how could we potentially make better use of the national tests. So it's not additional work for schools and learners, but we just use the data more intelligently. There was an agreement yesterday that we do need to progress this, but clearly it's with the national elections coming up, I can't really comment further at this point.
Okay, so it sounds like something that we need to keep an eye on in the future, just to see how it progresses and plans out. Okay, yeah. Thank you.
Okay, question 17, Councillor Cowles. Oh, sorry. Andy, did you want to come in? Sorry.
Only to add that Welsh Government are looking at the kind of a smorgasbord of data that's provided to schools, and we're an active part of that conversation. So just building on the keep your eye on it conversation, absolutely, and we'll be able to feed in as that piece of work progresses.
Thank you. Okay, Jane. Councillor Cowles, question 7. Thank you, Chair. This relates to the table in paragraph 4.13 of the report. So when do you expect the 2024-2025 NEET data to be verified, and do you anticipate much change in that data as a result of this verification?
Imminently is the answer to that one, Councillor Cowles. It usually is around the end of this month. Are we expecting any significant changes? No, we've got a very robust tracking approach. So there may be one or two individuals that Careers Wales has changed the status of since October when the census was completed. But we think the figures will be about the same as they are in that table.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Don't go away, John. I think Councillor Janet Jones, question 18.
Sorry. My question also relates to paragraph 4.13. Can you please explain why the number of NEETs may have seen such an increase, and how are we engaging with these young people? Secondly, what is the measurable impact of the work over the last 3 years?
There has been some change, so it might be helpful if I explain that change to put it in its full context. I mean, the numbers have increased since last year, but still are relatively low. And for each individual case where they haven't had employment, education or training, there's often quite a complex story behind it. But just in terms of why the numbers are perhaps as they are, most members I'm sure will be aware that the funding regime that sits behind this particular area of work changed last year. So it was predominantly funded through shared prosperity funding, which was due to end in April of last year. There was a significant change at that point in anticipation of that funding being removed, and an alignment with the Council's approach to early intervention and prevention. So much of the work that was done moved from what was formerly the Inspire team into the early intervention and prevention hubs. Some of the work was undertaken by staff members in the youth team. And although we got transition funding in April of last year to continue for the transition funding from SPF, it didn't allow for the same number of individuals to be working on this area, and that might be one reason why we saw a bit of a shift. We're seeing a change again now because that transition funding has come to an end, so there are some changes that are taking place at the end of this month, start of April. And largely that's around those staff who were in the Inspire team who went to work in youth will no longer be there. There's some enhancement to the numbers of staff working in the prevention hub in the early intervention and prevention area, and perhaps most significantly there was a separation in the early intervention and prevention hubs between complex and prevention. And those staff are now being brought into the prevention hub, which I think makes a great deal of sense. It's an area of work that, although the numbers, as I said at the start, are relatively low for the population of the borough, we know that we need to do as much as we possibly can to prevent somebody from not being in employment, education or training. So it's not something that we'd like to take our eye off. But just because of the way that the funding is structured, and the change of the council in terms of its early intervention and prevention focus, I think it's been a little bit destabilised, and I'm sure that over the course of the coming 12 months, some of that instability we will be able to have engineered out.
Something we need to keep aware of.
Absolutely.
Question 19 is relating to 4.14. And the question is, what mechanisms are available to ensure that members are provided with regular updates around post-16 education, particularly with regards to monitoring learner progression? John Tushingham?
This is something that we've been looking at for quite some time now. When we originally moved away from the post-16 delivery model before the learning zone was set up, we wanted to ensure that members had the ability to continue to have oversight of what was happening, even though the provision isn't directly by the council. It's a topic that's been raised again quite recently at the partnership that's referred to in the papers. And I believe that there's either a members' seminar or some members' forum that's going to be used shortly to present some information back to members and provide an opportunity for members to ask questions of colleague Grant and of ourselves about post-16 education in the borough. That's something that Jason may want to comment on further because he's had direct conversations with the college on it. But what we're also doing at the moment is trying to get a fairly standardised approach to the performance information from the college. It isn't always straightforward, and one example of where it's not straightforward, there's been a couple of references in this meeting to free school meals and the usual gap in attainment between non-free school meals and free school meals. We use a particular indicator for deprivation as being free school meals. The colleges don't always have access to the same indicator information, so there's work to be done. But I'm sure that we've got enough good quality information. The college has got good quality information that it can bring to members' attention, and I'm hoping that we will continue that interest in what the college is doing for our learners.
I think John's answered the question better than I could, certainly, but just as an add-on to that, we meet regularly with group of secondary schools and Coleg Gwent, where, as John's pointed out, we look at some of the performance data there. I think I referenced at the last scrutiny committee as well that we're anticipating or we're planning on having a member seminar with Coleg Gwent, so that some of the responses to the question posed there can be highlighted through our members' seminar.
As a supplementary, we've got a number of students head towards Hereford every day. Do we get that information through from the other post-16 providers?
That's something, again, within the regular meetings we have with Coleg Gwent, that's something we've been looking at. Obviously, we want to try and impact on that to keep our learners within Torfaen, so that's a key area of focus for us.
Thanks for that. Andrew.
Thank you, Chair. Just no, we don't have data for Torfaen learners that go out of county or to a range of private providers. As part of the regular team around the schools, Andy's introduced recently that we speak to a group of learners each time, and we were in one of the secondary schools recently, and we were asking them their post-16 destination, and there was, of the four we spoke to, none were staying within Torfaen. I think one was going to Hereford, one was going to a private sixth form college, one was going to a rugby academy, and another was going to Cardiff. It was a really interesting conversation with them about how they'd chosen their destinations. So this is something we'll continue to discuss at the post-16 partnership. There were very specific reasons for why those learners had chosen those destinations. I think we just need to bear it in mind about how we inform our local provision in the future.
John, do you want to come back?
Just very quickly to build on that, there was a very, what I thought, helpful conversation at the last partnership meeting between the schools and the college staff about the reasons why some learners choose to go outside of the borough. And one of the areas that was talked about was more able and talented students who we more often than not are in that cohort of people that choose to be educated elsewhere. It was a full and frank conversation really about that issue, and noted that in those cases quite often the parents of those learners really do welcome quite a lot of discussion with the colleges before they make their choice, and that's an area the college accepted they could probably improve.
Thank you. I think the trend started when we took the post-16 out of our schools, didn't it? So there we go. We need to keep our finger on that pulse. Thank you very much. The next question is question 20, and it's Vicky Hawler.
Thank you, Chair. My questions relate to Appendix 4, and Andrew already has answered some of the question in his answer to question 13 and 4.6, and that was around the wide variation of memberships across the working and strategy groups. So my follow-up question here is, why do some primary schools participate in up to 6 groups, while others are not represented at all? And does this create any concerns around capacity or available resources within our primary schools?
Andrew.
Yeah, some of it will be due to capacity. There's one small primary school I can think of where it's really difficult for them to release because the individual staff are covering multiple roles. So we do take that into consideration, and the Federation are quite open. Actually, Blenheim Coediva, that they are more able to take on additional work because of the size of the school. So we do take that consideration, but at the same time, where there are schools that are not attending any of the working groups, that is a bit of a worry for me, because we want the broad range of voices informing our strategy. There are also occasions where schools have got priorities locally. There could be extended absence of senior leaders due to sickness, etc. And we respect at that time, schools have to prioritise their own establishments. But it's something we keep an active eye on, and like I said, it has been raised at the full head teachers meeting and with the leads, and I would like every school represented at least one group.
Thank you, Andrew. Are you satisfied that all 6 clusters are sufficiently represented in the various strategy and working groups? So not just schools, but the clusters as well?
Yes, so in terms of the head teacher strategy group, I'll talk about that. So the terms of reference for that is that all secondaries and one primary from the cluster attend. So we make sure that there's actually there is 2 from each cluster representative. For the school improvement strategy group, it's 3 primaries, 3 secondary heads, and it's 1 from each cluster. So again, all 6 clusters are represented, plus for both of these, plus the PIU and the special school. So it's deliberately designed that there's cluster representation in those groups. So Claire might want to come in with some of the ALN groups. Claire?
Yeah, so it's the same for the ALN head teacher strategy group. So every cluster is represented, but we've also got, because that is an ALN group, we needed to make sure we've got heads of those schools with learning resource spaces in there, but also we've got mainstream head without learning resource space, a Welsh medium school, head of PRU, head of special schools. There's wide representation. And then in answer to the question around, do we monitor that engagement, I think for other working groups, not necessarily strategic groups, but for example, the Autism and Education Trust, we haven't given up on that. So if a school didn't or couldn't engage for whatever reason, the team have been really strong in following that up, so that we've made sure that there's been representation from all schools. At the moment, bar 3, where there were very specific reasons contextually why that school couldn't send someone, so the team will be reaching out to make sure they've had the same level of training. So if it's a priority from the Education Improvement Plan, we're making sure that we are following up with our school and facilitating that professional learning and that engagement in that group in whatever way suits that particular setting if they couldn't engage on the date that we set.
Thank you.
Andy?
Yeah, just then maybe to close the full loop on this as well. So those meetings typically take place on a half-termly basis, termly or half-termly. But importantly, they're lined up to happen before the full head teachers meeting. So then at a full head teachers meeting, all of the papers and minutes are presented at the full head teachers meeting by head teachers for all head teachers to be aware of what's being discussed, any decisions that have been made, any further actions that are necessary, and also just to take feedback and ask any supplementary questions, which, as an example, yesterday we then, as LA officers, came into the head teachers meeting and picked up. Well, we pick up those questions if there are anything further that needs to be discussed. So it kind of closes the loop nicely. We've got all of the activity in terms of groups, the minutes and the actions and decisions are taken to full heads, and nicely closed down.
Thank you very much. That concludes our questions for today. So can I thank officers for their time and contributions to the meeting, and ask if they'd like to leave the meeting now so members are able to formulate their recommendations. Thank you. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Jason. Okay. Members, can I please remind you that the meeting is still informal proceedings and still being webcast. May I remind members what's been asked of the Scrutiny Committee to consider when coming up with their recommendations today. Members have been invited to offer recommendations to the executive member on the development of the pupil progression and offer recommendations to the executive member on the progressing the further development of cluster working. Do members have any specific recommendations that they would like to make on the report?
Chair, there were 2 that I picked up on about the school assessment process. And I said that was something, a strategy. So could we have, is that going to be formalised into a strategy? School assessment.
That's a question rather than a recommendation.
Yeah, fine. Okay, I just want to clarify. But my other recommendation was about the NEETs and the funding issues. Is it that we recommend that we seek all measures to get funding to ensure that our children in NEETs are supported?
I think there's something brought up at our school visit and in today's meeting about data being aligned, whether it's, I know not every bit of data should be aligned, but specific data on progression which can I think there was also something on data alignment as well that was brought up within the school. I know Green Meadow School put some PowerPoint up on the board looking at their data. Wasn't aware that all schools were collecting the same data. So
yeah, that was brought up, wasn't it?
yeah, I think there's a need for a specific alignment with specific data that we need to have. Yeah, yeah. So that everybody's on the same hymn sheet, rather than everybody going off and doing whatever.
So in terms of a recommendation, so to encourage greater
data alignment, I would say, yeah. They can work on different topics, or you know, one on maths and one on English. But if we're not collecting the basic data, then we can't measure it correctly, can we? Any other recommendations?
I think just
Jane, Mark, Nick. Oh. Why is it the screen has gone dark? Yeah. It has. Yeah.
Do you want me to come in a second?
Yeah, please. Did you pick anything up, Geraint?
On the towards the end, on both of Vicky's questions, obviously around the working and strategy groups, they admitted there was a concern that some primaries were on none of these groups. So I didn't know. Obviously, they can't be forced on, but I didn't know if you wanted to sort of bring a recommendation around encouraging that primaries are at least represented on one obviously to address the concerns outlined by Andrew in his response. Really.
Yeah.
So if anything else to come in.
Yeah, I think just to think about Andrew's response to that around capacities in school, and if that needs to be addressed. The recommendation is to understand the capacity or lack of resource, possibly.
I asked that question last night, actually. You know, it was about, you know, when a member of staff has to go down from a comprehensive school down to primary or vice versa, you know, we have to cover those classes that member of staff would normally be working. So, yeah.
There's one that I pulled out, and it was around question 16, although I'm not sure how much. So the response we had is that there was no clear mechanisms from Welsh Government.
Yeah.
And I wonder if a recommendation could be that we I don't know if the right terminology is like lobby Welsh Government for some guidance.
Yeah, that
for the exec member to liaise with them.
Yeah, there we go.
That came out of last night's meeting as well, you know, with what Andrew said this morning. So, yeah, I think there might be something around performance information from the Learning Zone and our other post-16 providers, whether or not it is a cluster pupil conversation, a pupil voice, speaking to the students that are using external provision. So it's about...
Can I ask a clarifying question on that, just that you might know? You know the post-16 Coleg Gwent, is that just the Torfaen, or because there's other sites as well? So we were just talking about Torfaen Learning Zone.
Well, the Learning Zone, but John mentioned Coleg Gwent, so I'm assuming there's Cross Keys as well. But that could be the recommendation, that we pick up all post-16 providers. Yeah, to receive progression, I suppose.
I suppose part of that, though, is what Andrew alluded to, didn't he, in his response. He was talking about how it's difficult to get data for around any learners who may live in Torfaen or from Torfaen. Once they go outside of Torfaen, then it's difficult to capture that data to bring it back.
Even if they're at the same organisation but at different sites, because they're still...
I'm not
yeah, so
Coleg Gwent.
This may be something to sort of put rather than a recommendation, more around a comment, and it's something that could be addressed within that seminar / briefing that they're going to be bringing to all members.
Yeah, I suppose so. But we don't have fallout either, do we? We don't have that information. You might go to college for 6 weeks and then finish. Yeah, so therefore. Yeah.
two things I wanted to raise, Chair. Just perhaps a note that all governors are notified of their responsibilities to be monitoring the cluster plans. That could be added. And also that we have an update on the cluster working. I think they said at the end of the term, end of the year. Do we have another update on it?
Yeah, I was going to suggest that because when they drop off the focus on clusters, you know, we need to keep the focus on that, but by receiving further report.
Sorry, yeah. Do you mean having, because they've had the thematic review around the cluster working planning, and they obviously they're in the process of doing a thematic review around the learner progression side. Do you mean getting feedback from that?
Yeah.
Right, yeah. Okay.
Keeping the focus on. Janet.
Sorry, Gary. Liam and I just commented about the responsibility of the governing bodies. Should we have a recommendation that it would be useful to encourage all the governing bodies to fully understand the reports that we're doing on the hubs, because not all of them do.
Yeah, what I was going to say, I actually jotted down during the meeting rather than a recommendation, a comment, because they in their answer they acknowledged that there were gaps.
Yeah.
You know, so it's difficult sometimes to make a recommendation on something they've said they've acknowledged, and they're already doing it. But you can obviously make a comment to say that, you know, you were pleased to hear that, you know, they've identified any gaps, and, you know, that they are putting in place plans and professional learning to address
keep that on the laptop sheet.
Yeah, thinking about it, you don't want to recommend something that they already are doing.
Can I make a comment about how valuable I found the governor training in TAS last night when we heard representation from the Aberystwyth group on their progression? And would highly recommend all governing bodies take examples from it, whatever. Stuart.
I need to press the button again?
Yes, the microphone.
I was asking the question around how we're measuring real improvements within schools, and obviously that gives the dialogue there, right, that they are measuring it. The question I would ask, where do I go to find where this data is? Where is this actually data held? Where are the systems there where I can actually measure it, so I can actually see it for myself, and then see...
That might be something to pick up outside of the recommendation. It might just be a question just to perhaps get in touch with one of the officers.
Thanks very much. That takes us to item for the next meeting, agenda item 6. Karen, can you please take members through the next item, please? Is this our last one now?
I was just about to say, I'd love to when my computer works. Okay? I just started scrolling through my screen whenever. As I think I've mentioned in an email to you a few weeks ago, obviously because of the timings of this meeting and the next one, the report pro forma needed to... Sorry, everyone on screen. I've been waffling away and you wouldn't have heard any of that then. So you had an email off me recently that with the pro forma for the next meeting. Obviously, because of the timings of the meeting, if you remember, at the last meeting you had a work programme review and you basically agreed your items for the two remaining cycles, so cycles 4 and 5. So obviously we've just had the learner progression and cluster working now, and school catering is the last one, and that following comments and things from members, that got finalised and sent off to the officers, so they're in the process of writing that report. So basically, it's not really for a decision as such, this item on the agenda. It's more just for openness and transparency that that's the next item, and that you've previously agreed it, and the report...
Do we have an appropriate date? Are we okay to carry, because this is the 6th of May?
Yeah. It was going to be the 7th, which is the actual day of the election, so it's moved forward to the day before.
We are all right to take it within that.
Yeah, well this meeting itself was in, so, yeah, definitely.
Just want to clarify before I go on. Okay. School catering is on the next meeting's agenda. So the date and time of the next meeting will be on Wednesday, the 6th of May. The other time, is it then? Apologies. We're just saying that's the end of the meeting, but we're just going to stay behind for a review of how the meeting went on questions. So, date and time of the next meeting is Wednesday, the 6th of May at 10 a.m. I now close the meeting.